Good afternoon, everybody. We are kind of regrouping a little bit because we've had some issues pop up. Debbie's, our co-president's phone has been hacked. So I'm just unpacking my laptop and getting everything because I'll be doing most of the talking today. The portions that Debbie had, we're going to redo with me. So I'm just getting a second to unpack my laptop and we'll get going. But I want to welcome everybody. We have two wonderful panelists here. We have Anita Carson with Equality Florida and some wonderful practical stratagems that she's come up with to deal with so many of the problems that we have had facing anti-woke and anti-DEI matters. And this is problems that we have had, for the last couple of years. And now, lo and behold, with a new presidency, they are appearing nationally. And so we frequently say that Florida was everybody dealing with what we had been dealing with for many years. So, we're kind of ahead of the 8 ball, and we can share with a lot of other groups around the nation different tools. We also have Kimberly Rankins. She is at Human Resources. Oh, there you are, Kimberly. Human Resources Director for the City of Tallahassee, has a law degree from the Cumberland School of Law. And I know she ends up using that law degree quite a bit with her personnel issues, because that's kind of where we're at with that. We're going to try to see, has the new policies or anti-DEI policies, how has it had an effect, or what, if any, effect on the employment matters, education, and things of that nature. And we certainly want to cover not only racial minorities, but LGBTQIA and those who have disabilities. So you'll also hear a little bit from me from some of my experiences as an employment law lawyer. So my first question goes to Kimberly. Can you please give us a short description of your work at the city and try to define DEIA? What is that?
Okay, so it's really easy to get my office confused with human resources, and we've been asking the city to change the name of this office for many years, but I am the manager and the human relations official for the city of Orlando. The Human Relations Office, we are the civil enforcement office for the city's anti-discrimination ordinances. This office is also a fair housing assistance program through our certification with HUD, and we are also a Fair Employment Practices Agency, or a FEPA, being a certified agent of the EEOC. So what this office does, we file and we investigate employment, housing, and public accommodation discrimination complaints within the city of Orlando. We do have some resolution methods such as conciliation and mediation, where we try to resolve these discrimination issues with complainants. And we also have a Chapter 57 board that hears appeals, or that will also issue damages.
This meeting is being recorded.
On behalf of victims of discrimination. I'm sorry, I was being cut off a little bit with the recording messages. But if you just, I'll try to get to all of the questions that you ask, because DEIA is, it's not easy to sum it up in one sentence. But what it is organizational frameworks or initiatives that are put in place by organizations or workplaces. And the purpose of these initiatives or frameworks are to make everyone or all employees feel welcome, respected, and valued as a part of the staff. DEI frameworks or initiatives are there to remove barriers. They're not there to, force someone to hire a specific person. They're just there to remove any barriers that may have been in place through the organizational structure or individual personal biases. So, I mean, it's impossible for me to really go in depth with the limited amount of time that we have today, but DEI is so many things. What it isn't is affirmative action, which I think is something that a lot of people have gotten it confused with recently. It doesn't instill quotas. It doesn't force workplaces to hire at least 2 of this type of person. So DEI is totally different from affirmative action or any type of quota program.
I think that's really critical for people to understand, because when you hear the anti-DEI statements, that seems clear to be what the opponents seem to think it is. As in, the president saying, well, that's why they had the plane crash, which he had no basis for that whatsoever, and really showed, his biases and front and center. That's really important to understand. A related question: why was DEI created? Why was that program created?
It was created to remove the barriers.
Mhm.
Prior to companies or governments instituting DEI frameworks, there were some barriers that may have caused qualified persons to not be considered when whomever made the employment decisions in that organization made them. There may have been barriers there, whether they were intentional or not, because a lot of DEI, a lot of initiatives seek to remove the unintentional barriers, right? In employment decisions. So that's the purpose of it. That's what it's there to do. It's there to just remove barriers. If you're a person in a wheelchair or a person with hearing loss, accessibility can allow that employer to say, hey, let's get these $20 headphones that maybe increase the volume on a video or a call, so that this person who's perfectly qualified to do this job can hear what the customer is saying. So I think that, if people understand or know some of the examples around DEIA, it can help them understand it better, because it's not affirmative action.
Right. And I'd like to interject here and talk about several cases that I've had. I laughed. I said, because for those who may not know, my background is I was a private civil rights attorney, employment discrimination on the plaintiff side. And so I write books, but I can tell you about 2 or 3 cases that were very similar in different companies. And these were banks. And the banks had acting managers of their local facility, and they happened to be Black women. And they were looking to hire, the manager had retired, but these ladies who'd been there all the time, come up through the teller system, head teller and all the different titles, they were running those shops on their own. And in both cases, they had stellar numbers. They knew all the community, they knew the families, people were running to go to those banks because they were going to a friend, which is what the bank is supposed to be doing. And in the districts, they would have some of the best numbers out of 30 or 40, banking sites. And in each case, the decision maker, who is not overtly racist or against women, completely ignored their capacity and was bringing on young white men right out of college, 25, 26, no banking experience, and wanted that person to be the manager and wanted the black woman who was running the shop as the interim, person to train him how to be the manager. Of course, those cases settled. It was just crazy. And in deposition, each of those decision makers said, "Well, I just never saw Mrs. Brown as a manager." Why? She's doing the work. Her numbers objectively show she can do it and she's successful. Look at the facts. They were so taken with this person's persona, they just couldn't shift gears. They literally out of their mouths. And so DEI is a way to let people be aware of their own prejudices and catch themselves. Look at what the person can do, their resume, their past experience, and don't be bothered that maybe they're in a wheelchair, maybe they're over 65. Whatever, if they can do the job and you need the job done, you should consider that person and give them a chance. And that's really the difference of DEI. It's to eradicate problems so that the companies don't allow their managers, and sometimes it could be systemic, and there's other cases I could bring up, but it's certainly the implicit unconscious. I just couldn't see that person in that seat kind of biases. So that's really what DEI came for, is to open your eyes and look around, not to force your hand, but just open your eyes. And so I like to use that as an example of the difference between, as you say, quotas and affirmative action, and the employment anti-discrimination laws, which are to basically address the rights of the employee who has been mistreated because of their status, whatever status they have. So I just wanted to give that as an example.
And Miss Cecile, just to add to what you said, you're right on point. That case, so suppose that hiring manager had the resumes in front of them and the names had been blocked out, right? Then that would take away, then they were looking just at the merit of the person that that they were interviewing, and that could be like a DEI initiative, right? We're going to have a blind hiring process, right? So it's not a bad thing, it's a great thing. And so we don't have to call it DEI, we could call it risk management.
Yeah,
or we can call it liability management, because it does the same thing.
that's an excellent point, and one I'll keep in mind if we do have an opportunity for an op-ed. Anita, I'd like to go to you now. Can you give us a short description of your work and tell us, what does DEIA mean to you and Equality Florida?
Yes, I will be happy to. So
Zero
my
nine
name is
percent
Anita
voting
Carson,
5309
and
one what service to TFF.
Rosalind, can you mute your,
Please proceed to gate 12 for boarding. Thank you.
whoever, Rosalind Buttram, can you mute your phone? I guess she's in the airport. Go ahead, Anita, I'm sorry.
so my name is Anita Carson. I am the Field and Community Organizing Director for Equality Florida, and our work centers around systemic change towards LGBTQ people in the state of Florida. So a lot of what we do is based around legislative session here in Florida, but it is also around empowering community and growing community capacity to make change, positive change in our state. So Cecile and I were both at a meeting earlier this week, and I was talking a lot about how we at Equality Florida have been able to prevent laws from taking place that would have been in this space and would have been impacting LGBTQ people. Last year, there were 22 anti-LGBTQ bills filed in the state of Florida, and we were able to kill 21 of 22. And there are effective strategies to utilize, even in a place where we find ourselves with a lot of legislators that have not just unknown biases, but very well stated, perfectly happy to tell you about their biases. And so being able to impact that change is my job. That's a large part of what I do. As far as DEIA is concerned, realistically, the goal of that is to ensure that qualified people are able to do whatever that thing is, whether that is jobs, housing, even just being able to participate in civic life. Um, DE&I initiatives at every level, whether that's government DE&I initiatives, school DE&I initiatives, workplace DE&I initiatives, are meant to break down barriers so that we are on a closer to equitable playing field. So that can include things like buildings having ramps. If your building doesn't have ramps to go to the Capitol, they can't even, someone who has mobility issues can't even go and talk to their representatives, right? And so that would be a part of DE&I. When we're talking specifically LGBTQ people, not having strict gendered dress codes so that people who express their gender in a different way are still able to participate in public life or in work or in getting housing, pieces like that. So those are smaller examples, but D&I, the goal there is to break down barriers to get to what we hope everyone wants, which is a level playing field for people to compete in the workforce, to exist in our world, and to really fully participate as humans and as citizens in our democracy and what we're doing here.
I'm glad that you explained it that way. So, from Equality Florida's perspective, it's not just employment. Employment is a major aspect of how people are treated differently and harmfully in the workplace based on their presentation or their values or things of that nature pertaining to LGBTQIA issues, but it goes into housing, it goes into self expression, it goes into their humanity, their personhood of just being able to be in the world, be safe, and be authentically themselves.
Yes, ma'am.
So I think we are accustomed to, or the president is directing the conversation to the employability issue, which is important, very, very important. It's a major aspect of all of our lives. But the
Yeah.
Equality Florida is looking deeply at that, but at a broader spectrum of how people are treated.
Yes, ma'am. And one of the reasons for that is because while, especially in narrative and news, a lot of the way that you can get people to voice concerns about diversity, equity, and inclusion is if you tell them that something's being taken from them. And the easiest way to do that is when you talk about jobs. But when we look at the actual anti-DEI policies that are going through, a lot of them are based in our education spaces. So last year there were anti-DEI initiatives trying to be passed so that DE&I pieces on college campuses would no longer be allowable. So college campuses that have affinity groups for Black students, for Asian and Pacific Islander students, for LGBTQ students, are no longer allowed to use um, funding from their school, which is government funding, to be able to have those initiatives on their campus. That is anti-DEI policy. But when we have people who are trying to push these anti-DEI initiatives, generally they will only discuss employment out in a news type piece because people relate to somebody else got this job over me. And it's easier to relate to people so that they can control that narrative. Never mind that that job was never yours. That's a very entitlement space. No one got your job. Someone got the job, and they were also a qualified applicant. And so that's a functional way to shift that narrative for people is we've got to stop letting people get away with someone took my job. It wasn't ever yours. If you didn't have it to start, then it wasn't yours. It was a job that was open and available to qualified applicants, and a qualified applicant got the job. And Dee and I did not prevent you from getting the job. There was another qualified applicant. And so having those types of conversations with people is a little tough, but it's necessary at this point.
Excellent points. I'd like to ask you to talk to us a little bit about the litigation tools that Equality Florida has used to deal with some of the anti-woke laws. Again, we in Florida experienced a lot of this pushback and oppression a few years earlier than the rest of the nation. And people used to say things like, oh, you live in Florida, you poor thing. And now they're essentially getting the frontal attack across the federal government anyway.
Yeah. So one of the things that the narrative piece that we've been using in Equality Florida a bit is the Project 2025 concept is really Florida 2023. A lot of what is happening in the nation is being taken from what has already happened in Florida. And so we've been fighting these fights for a while. Um, One of the really great pieces is that even when legislation has been passed that is anti-LGBTQ or anti-DEI or in some way attacking equity and inclusion, a lot of times they are getting permanent injunctions in the litigation spaces, and generally it is because when they are making the laws and they're up there talking about why they want this law, um, we've been able to get them to name the bigotry or the animus out loud. And one thing that is really useful in a lawsuit is, regardless of whether or not the law was a good law, if it was made in animus, if it was purposefully bigotry in that law, it can get an injunction and then they would have to start back at the beginning. We saw this with the anti-drag legislation that was happening. Um, the anti-drag bill wasn't actually called the anti-drag bill. That was something that Equality Florida named it because this is one of those strategies. They put forward a law that sounds innocuous or that sounds positive instead of actually naming the harm that's going to have. And their rhetoric around it in the news spaces was that they were just trying to protect children from obscenity. The issue was that they wouldn't define anything appropriately. They would not clarify or narrow it, because just like with movies, right? You can have movies that are PG, PG-13, and R-rated. Same thing happens with drag performances. You have some drag performances that are very family friendly. You go to drag brunch, everybody is drinking mimosas and somebody is singing Mariah Carey songs. Very, very bland pieces. You also have drag shows and burlesque shows and much more adult shows that happen in an entirely different space. But because they would not define adult versus family friendly, and anything that was cross dressing was part of that wording, would have been considered inappropriate. We were constantly arguing. We would bring up people to testify at the committee meetings about how this would impact them, their livelihoods. Florida has a huge drag community that's how they make their living, and it is an industry here in Florida. I can't tell you the amount of money because I do not know. But it would be killing jobs, it would be killing an industry, and for the most part, it is not something that is in front of children. If it is in front of children, then it is a family friendly version. All of that to say, bringing people to testify, one of our strategies within litigation is to get the lawmaker to speak truthfully about what they're doing. The way to do that is having people come and testify and get them off of their game. So if you're having them speak and someone is naming the harm and you keep calling it the anti-drag bill and you keep calling it the anti-drag bill and they're like, it's not an anti-drag bill. Eventually Randy Fine goes, okay, fine, it's an anti-drag bill, but drag shouldn't exist. Well, now he has said on record why he is doing what he's doing. And then when we went to court, when Hamburger Mary's from Orlando went to court, they used the words from the lawmaker himself to get it to be an injunction against that law, and that law is no longer allowed to be enforced.
Enforced.
Yeah.
Mhm.
So that is a big part of our both legislative and litigative strategy, is making sure that when we are looking at policies and pieces that are coming forward, bills that are coming forward, we rename them to name the harm. We did that with the Don't Say Gay laws. That is not the name of the law, but it's the name that every person uses now, because that was the harm. It wasn't the parental rights and education, which is what they had officially named the law. Parental rights and education is actually had very little to do with what was going to happen when the law went through. And so renaming the law with it naming the harm, keeping the narrative centered on the people that it will harm. So constantly having parents and students that were in front of news outlets to talk about how it was going to harm them. And then when we go to testify in Tallahassee, trying to get the lawmakers off of their game so that they will say the quiet part out loud, that they are being bigots, that they are wanting to do things that are specifically set to be cruel and harmful, and then using that against them when we get to litigation strategies. Those have all been incredibly effective in what we're doing. And then the last strategy that I talked a lot about on our table meeting this week with Miss Cecile was wasting their time. There's 60 days of legislative session. They work Monday through Friday. Most of them take off Fridays. It's like 4 days a week. If they have a committee meeting and they have to get through 12 things on an agenda, and their committee meeting is 2 hours long, and the one piece of legislation that's anti-DEI that's on that agenda, you bring 40 people to speak and they all speak for 2 minutes, you've taken up the majority of their committee time. They now have to decide, do I want to do a TP, which is a temporary postponement, and hope that all these people go away? Do I want to cut their time to a minute each and hope we can get through this? Do I want to put it at the end of the agenda? They have to now re-strategize what they want to do in their agenda. And sometimes you can get them to completely temporarily postpone it, but if you know that you're going to be there the next day and the day after, they don't put it back on the agenda. So we had several things last session that got killed in committee because they couldn't get through the rest of their agenda because we were always there. Showing up at every meeting that something is going on about your community, whatever your focus is. I am a huge proponent of intersectionality as much as we can, but also that every group has their lane. And so hold your lane as much as you can and show up to everything that has to do with whatever your lane is. And working together. So it definitely, I say Equality Florida did this. We did this in partnership with lots of other organizations. So while we might only have 10 people that could come to that meeting, it might be that Voices for Florida had 5 people and ACLU had 2 that they could bring, and SPLC had 5 that they could bring, but then we had 50 people in the room. That is how we win this. We have to be working together. We have to be focused on what we're doing. And we have to gum up the works as much as we can when they're trying to push for hateful legislation. And this is not a partisan piece. This is looking at people's humanity, looking at how people are treated in our society, how they should be included in our society, and how do we make sure that everyone has a chance to be heard and included in our civic life.
Anita, this is amazing. Amazing. And this is being recorded. We are going to look carefully at the things that Equality Florida has done really well. And it was so grateful to be at the conference with you because I was aware that Equality Florida had been very successful, but I didn't know the underpinnings of your plans and your thinking. And this is, I'm so glad you're sharing it with not just the league, but there were many other groups at our convening. It was convened by State Voices, our partners. And so a lot of people were taking notes and going, oh, good. So hopefully we'll have more collaborations to do all the things that you were saying, force their hand to call out the harm. Then the league has been at the forefront with litigation. And we've been more successful, a little bit more in the earlier days. Now with we win at trial, and then the appellate judges unfortunately rewrite the law, and that's a whole nother issue. But these additional tools, we will look at them and bring them to bear. And we'll probably get on the phone with you. Hey, Anita. So I want to direct the next question back to Kimberly. Kimberly, what impact do you think the president's anti-DEIA statements have had on your responsibilities in the city? And essentially what I heard you say is that you are like, correct me if I'm wrong, a mini EEOC office. You are there to enforce laws against discrimination. Is that correct? I'm sorry, Kimberly?
I'm sorry, I muted myself. But that's correct. This office is a certified agent of the EEOC, and a certified agent of HUD. I think that initially it did affect this office significantly. We had hundreds of calls from people, hey, is my case still being investigated? Does this still apply to me? So a lot of people were confused about the executive order and how it applied to employment laws, or even housing laws. But I want to take a moment just for a second to stop and just make this blanket statement so that everyone can understand, because I have been kind of monitoring the chat a little bit.
Thank you.
And I do understand that language is important, but I want to make this clear. Employment discrimination laws, housing discrimination laws, and public accommodation discrimination laws exist to protect everyone. Everyone is covered under all of these laws. So I think that when we're attacking these laws, we're attacking our own rights, right? I have several cases in this office. They're not assigned to me, so no, it's not me investigating them. I don't want anyone kind of coming after me, but where we have cases in employment where we have white male employees who feel like they've been discriminated against because their workplace is maybe primarily Hispanic, or very diverse, and maybe they're being overlooked. And listen, those laws exist to protect white males, and we take that serious, and we investigate those cases and gather evidence the exact same way that we do any other case. We also have two cases in our office right now where two white males who live in primarily Hispanic neighborhoods feel that the policies are being applied to them differently or less favorably than his other Hispanic residents. So discrimination laws and DEI initiatives exist to protect everyone. Okay. It's not just minorities, it's everyone. So I think that, when we start kind of cushioning that, or using different, anything other than like industry specific terms, we can cause like confusion, or people may misunderstand what we're trying to say or the meaning behind certain statements. So I understand that. I think that historically, or maybe that I've seen in the press, that some people feel like DEI initiatives are there to make certain groups look bad, but that's not the case. That's not the case. It's there for the protection of everyone. The laws are there for the protection of everyone, and DEI is there to make everyone feel welcome. So, when we attack these things, we're attacking our rights as individuals, and we're attacking everyone's rights, not just the LGBTQ population, and not just, the minority population. We're attacking ourselves.
Yes, I've had several cases that I've represented aggressively of white men who
Mhm.
have felt and white women,
Mhm.
in different environments. And sometimes it's hard to believe, but
It
minorities
happens.
minorities can get in positions of power and they can fight back by excluding, and I proved it in both cases,
Mhm.
and it was happening. And for a minute you have to think, say, wait a minute, like you said, this is a human being mistreated based on their packaging.
Mhm.
They've done nothing wrong. They have the capacity. They're as good or even as everybody else. This is just like, someone who is disabled. And we do have our stereotypes that the plaintiff in these cases is going to be a black or brown person or someone with different
That's
nationality.
not the case.
It,
Our
it,
number one case is disability discrimination in this office, and the complainants that we serve are all races.
right.
They're all races, but they all have a disability. So over 50% of our cases in employment and in housing are disability related.
Right. So
Um,
everybody needs to take back, I mean,
mm,
because honestly, it was interesting. I had to do my own analysis and read a few articles to confirm what my beliefs were. Kimberly, this is your day-to-day job, so you were probably more up on it than I was initially. I've been spending so much time with the league that my private practice, I haven't taken a new case in 3 years. So I'm a little bit dusty. I can tell you the stories of the litigation I've had in the past, but basically the message that league members need to be able to express is
mhm,
DEIA concepts were to help companies not use implicit bias and block people out for who can do the work regardless of their packaging or their values.
mhm,
Because we had laws to prohibit that, it was in the company's best interest to route out this deeper attitude. And some people really are prejudiced, but they learned they couldn't enact it in the workplace. And that is why it's like Kimberly said, it was a risk management, a good
mhm,
thing for the companies so they wouldn't be sued. And they
mhm,
wouldn't, many of them don't want to cause harm to people. So it was a way to protect themselves, to have a more diverse workforce, which often brings a whole lot of different ideas to the workplace. That if you
mhm,
have it coming from one stream, you can't know everything. So that's what DEI is. It is not a quota. It is not affirmative action. So get that straight. And
mhm,
the
mhm.
federal protection laws for housing, employment, the
The
active,
the the
those are
American.
for everybody. Those are for everybody.
Mhm.
And you do have cases where the person who is a majority person, a white male, for example, it has been harmed. And we take those cases.
ADEA, the majority of our ADEA cases, the age discrimination cases, are white male employees. So listen, because we're not putting categories on these laws, it doesn't mean that we're not serving everyone.
Right.
Everyone is being served and everyone is being affected by workplace policies that attempt to place one group over another.
Right. There was a quick question that popped up. What happened to affirmative action laws? As far as I know, there are no affirmative action laws. They
I
never
don't
have
know of any.
been. Those are institutions may have internally said, we
Mhm,
want to take this policy to the point that we want to have so many women. Now, I know I had litigation, a lot of litigation with firefighters, and they used to have a rule, and I might be saying the poundage wrong, but that a person had to carry 150 pounds up, 2 or 3 flights of stairs. Well, very few women can do that wearing their masks and their fire gear and all the things. So they had to be able, because that was the weight of an average person. So they had to be able to carry their own gear in their plastic fireproof heavy clothes and a person. Now, when that was looked at, not my personal case, but when it was litigated, they looked at the work that firefighters did. That was a
mhm,
less than 2% of the work that they did. And they do so many things. So it was shown to be unconstitutional and against our employment laws because they were they were blocking women essentially from being a firefighter when that was only 2% of the job, and a firehouse might employ 100 people. So don't give the woman the job to carry the person up the stairs. There were many, many other jobs that the woman could do very well. They had nothing to do with physical strength or anything like that. So that's what we're talking about, that kind of thing. That's what the protection of the employment laws are for. But there was never an affirmative action law. So that's also a misconception. It was, but because the firemen in particular across the nation had been so verbally anti-women and verbally, many of them anti-Black. I had a case in Pensacola where the Black men had to live at the firehouse in the garage without air conditioning. This is my lifetime. This is cases I had in the unair conditioned basement where all the white men were upstairs, because that's how they did business in Pensacola. It blew their mind that the white men had to live in the same home with the Black men. That blew their mind. Well, put them in the basement. And they stopped that. But these are things that have happened. Much of the harm has been against women, minorities, disabled. That has been true. But over time, other cases have come out. So bottom line, in situations like that where firefighters have had this history, they may have said internally, we really need to be careful. If we have a woman applicant, we need to really be fair. Now, I don't know if that was a hard quota or just we're going to give a really good look at any person who might be qualified. Well, that was why they were doing that, is to eradicate a pretty well established history in writing, things of that nature. But let's move forward. We've blended a lot of questions that I with people's answers. So this is really good. I'm looking through to see what we didn't cover.
I wanted to just give a alternate case to what you said about the fighters. There have been numerous hiring cases for nurses who were males, right? Where because nurses, being a nurse is a career or a field that has been historically occupied by women. A lot of hospitals or facilities were not even considering male applicants of any race. And these men have been very successful in fighting, this discrimination in court and opening up those fields. So now that when we go into a facility, we see, we're guaranteed to see a couple of, male nurses. So
that's an excellent point.
So I just wanted
an industry that has been dominated by one gender, and as other people get involved and want to experience that employment, that they've had barriers. That's an excellent point that you raised up. But I want to just go and say to Kimberly, do you think that the anti-DEIA policies could interfere with a disabled person's ability to get reasonable accommodations for them to do the work?
I absolutely do, because I feel like some employers now maybe feel emboldened or feel like I don't have to offer you this accommodation, or I don't have to accommodate you, right? And so that's going to lead to fewer disabled people being in the workplace, unless they're bringing their cases, right? Unless they're bringing their cases forward and fighting this. I do think that the, anti-DEI measures may have a negative effect or a chilling effect, in definitely in government, right? Definitely in government and in private firms from enacting, policies or granting these reasonable accommodations.
I'm looking through now quickly through the question and answer. I know we answered a lot as we were going through. Kimberly, thank you for looking. Yes, the new Attorney General plans to prosecute Pam Bondi, who was elevated, she has written a very firm and strong letter to private companies decrying DEI. What do you think? What are your comments about that? Both you, Kimberly and Anita. What legal impact has, what legal or other impact can that have?
Anita?
Can you restate the question, because I was responding in the chat and I didn't hear it? I apologize.
Yeah, no, Pam Bondi, our new U.S. Attorney General, she has written a very strong letter to a lot of private companies, telling them that they need to cease and desist with their DEI efforts. Again, what are your thoughts about that and its possible impact? We've seen some of the companies pull back and say we're gonna cut it back, as, and again, sort of seemingly blending the concept of DEI and of quotas, which it never was.
Right. So the only basis that Pam Bondi has to send a letter like that is the executive orders coming from Trump. But there's nothing in law that has changed that requires people to abandon these at all. And because the executive orders are not US law and they don't hold the power of law, there is no consequence for it. There is no measure to hold something against those companies if they don't. And so any company that is worth their salt and has a legal team should be holding firm on whatever they want to do in their hiring practices, because there are not laws other than the anti-discrimination laws that we've been talking about. There are not laws that require DE&I policies, and there are not laws that prohibit DE&I policies. And so if they are taking them down now, it is out of fear, not out of legal obligation. And for us to impact that, we have to be pushing back against them and showing them that if you are taking away these pieces that provide fairness in your hiring practices, and you are not going to continue to try to provide fairness in your hiring practices and in the way that you do business, then we are not going to be supporting your business any further. I really think that that is the best way to combat this as individuals and as groups. But there is no legal basis for them to be scared, because there is no law that requires them to remove it. It is literally out of fear or out of a sense of obligation to the presidency. So we definitely see more conservative companies that are trying to back the presidency, and so they're following it in that way. But then we see companies that used to stand pretty solidly in more progressive space and used to talk about backing fairness and equality and equity, pulling away their DE&I standards. And those, at least for me, are even more disheartening, because it makes it very clear that their principles weren't principles, they were things to attract money. And that's really frustrating. So at this point, for me, and with Equality Florida, you'll see Nadine Smith, who's our executive director, has been posting on Facebook recently about different protest pieces and different boycotts of companies that are no longer supporting our communities. If you're not willing to support fairness for our communities, then we will be restricting how much of our money you get. But yeah, there's no legal basis for it. It's either out of a sense of fear or a sense of obligation to the presidency, and that is it. There is nothing that requires them to pull away from DE&I in any type of legal basis.
Does anybody else have any questions that are not in the chat and you'd like to raise your hand? And Blake will help me monitor.
We do have one hand from Leslie.
Okay, Leslie, would you state your question?
In regard to our standing as nonprofit and the things that are going on now with nonprofit statuses, are we concerned about our advocacy? We're actually working now on some presentations for our local league, and we are wondering how we address speaking towards DEI policies that we support. in light of this nonprofit, I don't want to call it.
Yeah, I know, I'm familiar. It's like, it's a congressional bill like 94 or 92. We complained about it to LWVUS and put them on alert about it. What she's talking about is a bill that passed the House. It has not passed the Senate, but it gives the executive branch the ability to question your nonprofit status under the IRS if they think that you're dealing with terrorists, is the connection. So it would be a far reach to
Yeah.
people first, using their First Amendment rights to talk about things, to say that was meant that you were a terrorist. One
Mhm.
never knows, but that is a literal writing of the bill. And so there was a lot of brouhaha raised with the Senate. And I think people are much more aware that with the propensities of the administration of stretching laws, coloring outside the lines, and all the other things, that this could be a very terrible uh,
Mhm.
stick to hit nonprofits with. We are
Mhm.
aware of it, but I think our stance, and we've spoken to LWVUS on this very point, is to carefully state our position. And that's one of the reasons we had this lunch and learn on this topic. And we
Mhm.
can come forth with some written words that's hard to remember the whole conversation of things that you can import into your presentations to address the distinction between DE&I, between affirmative action, between the federal protection laws and how they help everybody. So I think if we sort of redefine and get people to not merge them all together, we'll
Mhm.
have a much better chance of educating and letting people know what we really stand for. We stand for letting everybody who wants to participate in the league have an opportunity. That's it. We're not going to bend over backwards to someone who is completely unsuitable to be in the league just because they're disabled or just because they're Black. If they've got other issues that don't make them a good candidate, then that would be considered. So, but what we're saying is we want open access. We want to hear from all persons, is really what the league is saying.
Mhm.
Can I comment
Yeah.
on that one, Cecile? Is that
Yes,
okay?
please. Yes.
So we've had to navigate this as well. We're a 501c3. Equality Florida is a 501c3 as well. And so looking at how the law is worded, part of the problematic piece is you'll see they're redefining who is a terrorist. So you'll see them talking about like Black Lives Matter being a terrorist group. And if you're supporting that, then you are supporting terrorists. Describing Mexican cartels as terrorist, and then if you are helping people who have come across the border illegally, which they've defined all of them as cartels and bringing crime, then you're helping a terrorist. But the issue is going to be, as long as you are keeping very clear, like Cecile said, on your focus of inclusion, we're trying to pull people together, and you're not veering off into something way further out than you should be fine. Because anything that we've talked about today, if they come after you for that, would be considered viewpoint discrimination, which is against the First Amendment. And that's got very, very clear litigative support. So if they do come after you at that point, you're not supporting terrorists, and it would be a viewpoint discrimination suit. And it would be, I mean, as
Yeah,
long as our
as,
Supreme
as
Court
Anita is
holds up,
saying, I
you would
can
be fine.
I can say this, and Anita knows, even with very conservative jurists, they
Mhm.
love the First Amendment. I mean,
Mhm.
that is something that deep in the hearts of the most conservative person, they don't, because they feel like their voices have been cut in
Mhm.
liberal, environments. They're the ones who were not given the speaking opportunities in so-called liberal universities. And so they are very, very protective of the First Amendment, and they get it. And I've had these issues in federal court sometimes. I've had a couple of times with a gay person, and we used the First Amendment argument and academic freedom, and we
Yep.
prevailed, or we got a settlement because the school did not want to go down and dirty with being looked at as somebody that's censoring and doing all the things that we don't believe in. So the First Amendment is a very big protection, not only I would say objectively, but has been demonstrated with conservative judges. They will they will rule in your favor on that point, but maybe wouldn't have ruled in the favor of a Black person being called a racial name a couple times. They might say, that's a stray remark. That's not too bad. And we have cases that say that. But if show that Black person wasn't able to talk about, their personal beliefs in the workplace that was not harmful to anyone, they would protect the Black person's rights on that. So that's been the history that we've had. We're getting ready to close because we started a little bit late. If anybody needs to go because they have appointments, we certainly understand. But I think if I can ask my two panelists to stay on, we started, I think, about 7 or 8 minutes late. We'll just hang on to that point so they get their full hour for those of us who are able to do that. Is that correct, Blake? Is that how much time we lost in the beginning?
Yes. Uh-huh.
Okay. So people have mentioned, and Kimberly, jump in and correct me or add to my comment, the case at Harvard, my old alma mater. And it was Asian students and their parents were connected with an extremely conservative gentleman. And many people feel like they were used, but they were the plaintiffs and they attacked the affirmative action policies that Harvard had. And it's been ruled by the Supreme Court that race should not be a determining factor for college admissions. And that is the state of the law. And that's changed from allowing it to be considered. So, what people are doing now is they're looking at the whole person. For example, if you had somebody that grew up in a certain environment, that let's say they grew up in the urban environment where there were very little resources, they could talk about that experience and how they could bring that perspective to the marketplace of all the Harvard students sharing their backgrounds. And then that would be something that would add a new viewpoint to the experience at Harvard and the classes. You would speak up from that perspective, and that would be valuable. But Harvard is not, or any other college, going to be allowed to say, we need this Black person because they're Black. So I don't ever think they were doing that, to be honest with you, but I think that they were probably giving some points. But I can share because I've done probably about 50 or more interviews for students on behalf of Harvard who want to go because they really want an alum to interview all applicants. It doesn't always happen, but that's the goal. And I know for a fact that if your family member has gone to an Ivy League school, you get a point for that. If you have your family member has given a lot of money to the school and endowed a department or research, you get a point for that. If you are an athlete, we don't have scholarships for athletes, but that is something that the coach can come down and say, this person's going to contribute to the wealth of the university. So there have been a lot of things that people consider, in the same sense that they consider your background. And so a lot of this has been a little bit taken out of perspective, but those other points of view and considerations of who you are and what your family or people have brought, those are still intact. Do you know what I mean? It's like the average middle class person from Kansas, many times they're the first person going to an Ivy League. They don't have that. They're middle class. Their ancestors and people didn't donate millions of dollars for a department. They don't have that. They may just be an average kid, not the best athlete. So there are still in many of these schools things that people look at that they think is going to contribute to the value of the school. And in that sense, that's how they're looking at race or your background. They're not allowed to give you points for race, but they can look at your background, which might be influenced. Let's say if you were a Jewish person and you went to Jewish schools and you were very, well informed on that, and you could share the history of Jewish people in a way that a non-Jewish person couldn't bring. They're entitled to look at what you can bring to the table and to add to the conversation.
Mhm. I definitely agree. I mean, looking at a person's background and their experiences, because listen, being Black is not a monolithic experience. Everybody, everybody, I know people that, came from a lot of money, their family may be considered a racial minority, but this person had drivers. And I'm like, I need a driver here in Orlando. So being a minority is not monolithic. Being a white person is not a monolithic experience. I grew up with plenty of people. I grew up in the South on a farm, in a very low populated area. I knew people that ran around in the dirt. They were poor. My grandmother took baskets to their home, and they were a racial majority. So being white isn't monolithic. Being Black isn't a monolithic experience. But I think that looking at the experience of the individual and maybe how they fought through the ranks to overcome barriers that were in place, whether they be socioeconomic, whether they be prejudices, illnesses, family or familial issues. It brings a lot, I guess, a wealth of knowledge into the education space. It brings a different type of motivation and initiative into the education space. So I definitely agree with taking, those experiences into account when considering admission. Right? That's my.
Well, I want to thank you, Kimberly,
Mhm.
and we may get back with you on this. And I've seen people put comments about what the university professors can do. You got to be a university professor who's willing to fight that. And we did have 2 university professors that did, Stacy and others, and we gave them an award for it.
Oh,
The David King Award for protecting rights, and it was the Fritz Wehrmuth, their law firm protected rights, and we named, and the King law firm that helped us with our redistricting, we named our Democracy Protector Award in their name, but we gave it to the professor. Oh, let's see, Dan Smith and Michael at USF. I'm sorry, University of Florida. They were 2 redistricting professors, and they testified in some of the litigation that we brought at Senate Bill 90, how it impacted Black people. And the university told them they couldn't. And so they use, if we'll try to maybe share the name of the case with our members so they can read it. But I believe they used some First Amendment issues and also uh, uh, academic freedom. And with that, we'll say goodbye. And Anita, thank you and Equality Florida for really figuring out some wonderful strategies on how to shut down this horrible, oppressive laws, as you said, that are intended as to be biased. So we thank you for that, and we'll say goodbye. Thank you all.
okay. Thank you.
Bye-bye.